Having said that, just to update on what the legal situation is in this country, we are now facing a position where advice has been drawn up by the Law Commission for the government to consolidate, as they call it, the official secrecy laws in the UK. So at the moment, if you are an intelligence whistleblower, you face 2 years in prison. If you are a journalist covering and breaking the news of the story provided by that intelligence whistleblower, you potentially face 2 years in prison. If you are republishing something that is already in the public domain, you are legally allowed to do so. That comes out of the Peter Wright spycatcher ruling from back in the 1980s. What the Law Commission is now proposing to the government is to consolidate and tighten up our secrecy laws in this country. And what they are proposing is that whistleblowers coming out of the intelligence agency, the military and central government will now face 14 years in prison with no legal defence. Journalists reporting this information will now face 14 years with only no damage defence. And the prior publication of information will no longer be a defence under law if you reprint something. Now, this is appalling because the 14 years in prison is something that traitors face when they betray their country, not whistleblowers and not journalists. So the pushback, even in this country, is appalling. And the pusillanimous attitude taken by our government in not protecting someone like Julian Assange, who is a publisher, is appalling. The craven attitude of our mainstream media in this country, who are not laying out the facts about what Julian has achieved, is bloody appalling. And that's what we're facing at the moment. I speak a lot. For obvious reasons, I have been very concerned about my personal privacy being snooped on, because I am the gamekeeper indeed turned poacher. I know what the spies can do to follow you. So I've been speaking out about privacy and about whistleblowing for many, many years now. What I see now very clearly is a ghastly confluence of the corporate and the state. Now, if I were a psychiatrist, I would be aware of something they call the dark triad, which is the worst possible combination of psychiatric, sociopathic aspects in one human being. And in fact, they confluence very well in James Bond, if you're interested. The first one being Machiavellianism, the second one being narcissism, and the third one being psychopathy. It's a nasty combination. What I would say is what we're looking at the moment in what's going on in terms of our internet freedoms, I also would describe as the dark triad. So we're looking at three forces of darkness coming down to clamp down and prevent the future development of our internet freedoms. First of all, we're seeing the corporate side of things, be it big social media watching everything we do, be it copyright laws, intellectual property right laws, which we're seeing being pushed further and further even within the EU legislation recently. So that's the business side of things. Of course, there is a crackdown on hackers, criminals as they want to call them, or hacktivists, as many of us like to call them. And also, of course, there's what the spies do, which has been laid bare in all its gory detail ever since Edward Snowden went public, with a whole slew of information coming out about precisely how complicit the corporations were, and also how much the spies are doing to us and how they can frame people. What we've also seen as well, and I would recommend if you're not familiar with this, is a WikiLeaks disclosure a couple of years ago called Vault 7. And this was very interesting because it showed that the CIA had developed tools to make it look as if something were hacked, then it could be made to appear as if it were hacked by the Russian government or by the Chinese government. There are specific programs along these lines. So we have a situation now where what on earth can we believe on the internet? We are told there is fake news everywhere. We are told there are laws being put in place to crunch down on fake news, but those laws are being used to crunch down on freedom of expression as well. And indeed, just one final point, what we're looking at with what is happening to Julian Assange, a high-tech publisher being crushed by these ridiculous charges and faced with God knows what in the US if he is extradited. and we only have one charge. We know that there's been a secret grand jury convened for years, pulling together all sorts of other charges, potentially under the Espionage Act. What we are looking at is the very fulcrum that will kill our freedom on the internet, all of us. Not just for publishers, not just for journalists. It could disappear any of us. We will lose our freedom of expression. So the key final point here is the irony. Do you remember during the whole Russiagate hysteria post-Trump election, we had a situation where there was something called the dirty dossier pulled together by a former MI6 intelligence officer, Christopher Steele. Now, that turned out to be a bunch of rubbish. But he was sued in an American court by 3 of the Russian oligarchs he had traduced in this dirty dossier. And the judge in that case said very clearly in his final judgment, his final ruling at the end of that case, Christopher Steele, even though he is British, even though he is resident in Britain, is deserving of the First Amendment rights under the US Constitution, which means the right to freedom of expression, because what he did was in the public good. And yet now we see the point where someone like Julian Assange, an Australian living in Britain, is already explicitly denied, apparently, his right to the First Amendment, his right to freedom of expression, if he goes to the States. How is that justice? Well, we know there's no justice in this. This is a political act. But there are so many dark, swirling circles under what appears to be a fairly simple case of extradition. And all I can say is, if we do not stand up for WikiLeaks, if we do not stand up for Julian Assange, a man who was a visionary, a man who has displayed exemplary courage and exemplary fortitude over the last few years, we do not deserve to live in a democracy. We need to fight and we need to support him, otherwise we will all lose our freedoms. Thank you very much.